I want to start because the focus of this conference is really on AI, which is maybe in some ways like other technology revolutions that we have lived through over the last few centuries, but in some ways profoundly different. And I'd like to start with a quote that came from Vladimir Putin a couple of months ago, where he said, "Whoever controls AI will dominate the world." Now, I'm not sure Vladimir Putin is the world's leading expert on AI, but he clearly knows something about power. And so I wonder if I can get the panel to talk about that. Who wants to jump in first? Paul, do you?
Let me jump in there. I think AI has sort of become a very hot topic, obviously, particularly in the last year. With the release of China's National AI Development Plan and sort of some of the reactions we've seen. I think the way to understand AI in the US-China context is important. I think Putin here was probably really talking more about something like artificial general intelligence, but we can talk about that. But I think in the US-China context, technology has become a real issue in three broad categories. The first is in sort of the trade space, where we've got issues around the US Trade Representative's 301 investigation, which is talking about industrial policies, concerns the US has with China, and things like market access. Then the second piece is really supply chains, issues like export controls in the US, investment restrictions, which we've seen recently. And then the third piece is really the struggle for strategic technologies like artificial intelligence and like quantum computing. And unfortunately, in the US, many people are viewing this as sort of a zero-sum game. You know, the US wins and China loses. The problem with AI is that, for example, the communities are very tightly intertwined. And there's a tremendous amount of collaboration. And so, for example, recent moves by the US to consider export controls around artificial intelligence, including algorithms and chipsets, are very worrisome because that could impact innovation and AI on a broad scale. So I think AI has sort of become a big concern in the relationship, and I'm concerned that particularly the collaboration that has been happening between the US and China may be in jeopardy or not. So I think that's the way to think about AI in the broader US.
Jennifer, it's a concern for good reason, right? I mean, if decision-making is markedly improved by artificial intelligence, it's got to have an effect on geopolitics.
For sure. I think, you know, the reason why AI is unique in many ways, so one of the very important cases, AI is a general technology, right? General technology that can pretty much apply in every single industry. And the foundation for AI is data. And, you know, whenever there is, data, some of the companies we invest in, if it's US dollar invested in, they cannot get Chinese government's contract, right? And vice versa. So I think that kind of concern is very legitimate, is very real. However, I also think there is a greater picture we need to pay attention to, which is the politics, right? The politics between the two countries. Right now, I think there is a sentimental part of the argument that's not healthy, which is in one hand, US just started to realize, oh, China is actually, really developing so fast, especially after 2013. We always joke in China, we have a B2C, B2B model, but prior to 2013, we had C2C model, which is copy to China. Basically, whatever US company would just copy to China. That was the model. We had the China's Facebook, we had China's Twitter, we had the China's YouTube, etc. However, after 2013, one thing happened, which is WeChat. The super app really enabled so many startups, so many entrepreneurs in China come up with our own innovation. And that has really taken the entire country's development into different direction, generated a tremendous amount of data. Li Kai-fu, in his recent book, he talked about China is Saudi Arabia in terms of data, like Saudi Arabia as oil, right? So I think the argument between the political bigger picture in terms of the sentimental argument, lacking the nuance in terms of how China and US need to collaborate on AI. AI as a general technology is actually going to bring a much bigger debate, much bigger challenge in terms of ethics that's facing by the entire human race. It's not just two countries. So this is the juncture actually I think the two countries have to be very, very careful.
I think that one of the things that both governments are missing badly is the real asset is not the data. The real asset is their people. And the thing that's most disappointing, especially to look at China today, is that we're giving, especially the Americans, they're reacting to the American government is reacting to the Chinese government as if the Chinese government was responsible for creating the entrepreneurial ecosystem in China. It was not. So going back to 2000, from 2000 to 2017, there was $45 billion of true risk capital, Series A seed capital. 87% of that was in dollars. Okay? So that was not something that grew in of itself completely within China. That ecosystem that the entrepreneurs created was done with a great deal of outside help because people saw the investment opportunity. And the Chinese government contributed benign neglect for a long period of time. I think it's a terrible mistake for either the US government or the Chinese government to start talking about an AI policy, because it's not going to be the government that's going to make this successful. It's going to be the entrepreneurs on the ground that's going to make this successful. And I think that we're diminishing dramatically the contribution that the Chinese entrepreneurs have made to this ecosystem and to the future success of Chinese AI companies by somehow saying, you know, the government is going to be directing this. I think that's a terrible mistake.
All right, but Professor Shen, I need you to put a little geopolitical reality into this conversation, because there's a bit of kumbaya going on here. Why can't we all just get along and work together on these technologies, and they will benefit everyone? But there is something fundamental, goes way beyond President Trump and President Xi. It goes into sort of the fundamentals of great power competition that AI and technology is provoking here, isn't there?
Well, AI by definition is artificial, which is not human. It's human that trains artificial. But a human has a limit. And a human could be emotional, can be prone to make a mistake. Once a human gives the calm, real intelligence to the machine, machine may have no limit. Machine may not make a mistake. That's the formidable power that we pay respect to AI. That may make a weaker country to emerge quickly if it would acquire AI. That's President Trump is very much worried. China can extend very rapidly by integrating the global human intelligence to make a Chinese style of artificial intelligence that eventually would empower China to be excellent. Therefore, he tried to manage how China would not rise through online safety, attaining others' human intelligence to make China's human intelligence illegally powerful. So he wants to handle this. And China's answer is that I'm building my own AI legally, self-reliant way. So why you would blame me? So this is the current debate.
So isn't, Professor Shen, just to follow up on that, isn't that going to make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for this trade dispute to be resolved by a conversation in Argentina?
No, I think we should respect the U.S. concern. U.S. say, why you are doing online safety? So Chinese government has worked with previous U.S. government, the Obama administration, to create a joint dialogue mechanism for the internet safety, internet crime. We have the mechanism. Luckily, President Trump has continued. He created 4 mechanisms of dialogue with China instead of 2, and retaining this particular one. So he considers this is very important. He is not doing anything but Obama. But for this, he keeps. But with this year's trade dispute, he is not continuing the dialogue. So we have a system. China would say, I'm respecting your claim. Therefore, I would tell you, come to me to have a joint investigation. He said, unless you resolve the trade dispute, I'm not working with you. That would make the mutual suspicion and mutual displeasure more serious. I think we have a mechanism. China should use joint investigation to clean itself. And China may also lodge a protest. Why you steal my technology? So U.S. should assist China to clean itself. This way, both would be innocent and to win the respect and build trust.
Jennifer.
I'm under no illusion that the trade dispute between China and U.S. is very real, right? But I think President Trump, he probably you can argue he doesn't have any strategy or plan but he is a genius when it comes to like intuitively control the narrative, right? Part of the narrative in terms of the domestic politics in the U.S. today is that a lot of people, especially working class, his base is facing this tremendous disruption in terms of the job future, their wealth, and it's being disrupted by tech innovation, which tremendous disruptions coming from AI-driven economy. And I think if you take back China, as I mentioned, I started my first company in Guangzhou. I'm from Sichuan. I'm a mainland Chinese. In my lifetime, I feel like I've lived 3 completely separate lives, right? When I was a kid, we didn't have food. But today, we're talking about competing with the US. So I think on one hand, China needs to learn how to articulate much better in terms of what does our rise, and this rise is historically rapid. What does this mean to the world? And then on the other hand, I also think the US probably need to reconcile that, you guys had a great run in the last century. This century, perhaps there will be another superpower is going to share the space. And in terms of so when I was in university, the first batch of native English speakers were American missionaries, right? So our worldview was shaped by the first window, through the world was American missionaries to see outside of China. We've been told this is the American way to look at things. This is the U.S. lens. On the IP issue, which is one of the biggest debates, right, between this dispute. So if you're completely looking at the U.S. point of view, that of course IP should be protected, and I personally agree. However, the reality, either you like or not, in China, because of lack of IP, that creates extremely intense competition that no other country has seen. A lot of innovation existing in China is not because of lack of IP, but not because of protection of IP, but precisely because it's lack of IP. Because when you create something that's very useful in China, the next day, what you need to worry about is 10 people are going to copy you. So you have to keep innovating. So those are the very nuanced difference that the politicians in 2 countries probably not really articulate very well.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think it's important that Trump, you're exactly right that Trump is very good at articulating the problems. I think the problem is in the U.S. government, there's a lot of debate over how to approach China more broadly. So we tend to, when we talk to clients, talk about basically 4 different groups. So you have the sort of people focused on the trade deficit, which has been a longstanding issue that the president's been interested. But there's also the sort of trade structuralists that are looking at things like IP, market access, industrial policy. But there's also a group of what we call the supply chain nativists, and they're concerned that over the last 30 years there's been too much a concentration of ICT supply chains, the information computer technology supply chains in China. And so part of their view is let's use the tariffs, which is currently an issue of great discussion, to force companies, the U.S. companies, for example, to reconsider putting some of their supply chains in China and locating manufacturing there. Yep. And then there's a 4th group, finally, that sees a sort of a long-term economic challenge from China and really wants a little bit more confrontation and is not really interested in a trade deal. So I think that's the challenge for what's going on in
that's a really important point, and I think people outside of the U.S. may miss it, that this issue extends way beyond Trump. And would likely be an issue, maybe not in quite the same way, even if there were no President Trump. I mean, if you look in the program, this panel is entitled Escaping Thucydides, which is a reference to work that Graham Allison did on what he calls the Thucydides trap, that throughout history, when you've had a situation like the one we're talking about, where one great power is declining and another great power is rising, more often than not, it's resulted in war. Is that where we're headed here? I mean, is there an escape from the trap?
So we're not going to war, okay? I'll pay your children's education if that actually happens. So you're not going to go to war.
How long is that guarantee good
20
for?
years.
20 years. Okay.
That's the time frame I probably care. After that, it's up to God.
Okay, good.
So, but the issue
Glad we
is,
solved that.
so you're going to have competition, but you don't need to have conflict, okay? And I think that people are conflating the two. So it's very easy to say that competition and conflict are the same thing. Conflict implies a winner and a loser. Competition does not. And I think that that's something we need to change our mindset in terms of how we're thinking about these two countries as they relate. Because you're not really talking about the countries competing. What you're talking about are the companies competing, the entrepreneurs competing, the pools of capital competing. So when you get far more nuanced and you look at how those line up, it's not clear at all where the necessary advantage is. When we talk about Trump, Trump doesn't know the difference between tariffs and taxes. So when you talk about him understanding technology, give me a break. Seriously, the White House in the last 5 administrations has never had so few people with a technology background serving in the cabinet. So for the last 20 years, we've never seen a cabinet so light on really understanding technology and technology trends. So I would like to think there's a plan, but you can't look at their behavior.
You'd rather see the White House focus on technology development than focus on trade?
I'd rather the White House and America focus on making America better and let everyone else worry about themselves. And right now, I don't think that the future of the United States is dependent on what China does, India does, Africa, et cetera. The future of the United States is dependent upon what the US does.
Yeah, let me add to that. I think there's in the U.S. What's happened is over the last 3 years is there's been a lot of focus in China on sort of national strategies. So, for example, China established this integrated circuit investment fund in 2014, and this concerned a lot of people that this was going to be used to appropriate the global semiconductor supply chain. And then you had things like Made in China 2025, which has become a big focus of the current dispute, which is perceived as potentially leading to overcapacity in some key sectors like semiconductors, for example. And then you have Belt and Road, Yidai Yilu, and that again, I think there's a lot of misperception in the West about how these programs develop, what they are, and how they're going to manifest. And there's a perception that these are all, long-term plans that are all government focused and driven. And of course, there is a big private sector element to all these. And a lot of times they're perceived as plans when they're really, the Chinese government, I think, perceives them as guidance. So the problem is, I think there's misperception on both sides. The US government is concerned rightly about things like subsidies and over capacity in certain sectors. But I think there's a tendency to take something like the AI National Development Plan, which calls for China to dominate AI by 2030. And this sets off a lot of alarm bells in the West, even though I've talked to some of the drafters of the AI plan, and they say that it'll be overtaken by events in 2 years, and they view it very much as guidance and not as...
Wait, dominate is not necessarily a word you would use.
Right, exactly. That's right. Right, well, that's the problem, is some of the wording of this is concerning.
Yes,
well, you mentioned suicides. I think that would not happen. Yeah. For one reason, China is not imposing its ism, ideology upon the US. So the US should have one party. China is not doing it. Second is the two countries have nuclear weapons, so no one would not take this into consideration. China is not shooting any bullet for 30 years externally. US has generated a disaster in Iraq without the UN authorization. It's a huge self-destruction. So I don't worry about the mutual threat. It's the US self-posed threat.
Yeah.
And China's probably self-posed threat to itself, which is a lack of reform, lack of implementing its commitment. Don't steal. We should implement. Whenever we find a company, we should punish it to make it bankrupt.
But so you're saying both countries need to focus on their problems.
US is hurting US. China is hurting China. China should do more reform to encourage our domestic indigenous innovation, to punish this safety. And the US should be humble not to invade another country, to harm it, and to make it to harm the US, to generate IS.
But that's not going to happen.
On either side.
Therefore, no suicides. But a non-suicides is China's lack of interest in punishing its safety. Yes. And the US deep trust that China is rising through such unfair business pattern. That has led these two great countries to have greater suspicion.
Yeah. If the wise advice of this panel is ignored, which there seems a decent probability of, and we continue down the path towards a trade war, who gets hurt most? The U.S. or China?
I think in the short term, probably China are going to suffer a little bit because U.S. is still a larger economy in many ways in terms of IP, such as more advanced than China. But if you pay attention to how quickly China has developed in the last few decades, I think the long term, I'm bullish on China much, much more. And in the U.S., the rhetoric is very much about we have to decouple with China. I think that would be a lot easier if China and U.S. was a couple to start with.
Well, yeah.
So if you look at the U.S., the largest company by revenue is Walmart. And that has everything integrated so deeply in China. The largest company by market cap is Apple. Apple would not exist today or on the scale today without China.
Without China.
Right.
Paul, would you agree with that China gets hurt in the short term in a trade war, but the U.S. probably gets hurt more in the long term?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look, and again, it depends on the sector, but if you look at, for example, semiconductors, you take the 5 largest companies. We had Intel earlier, you take Qualcomm, Broadcom, Intel. These companies are deriving a huge amount of their revenue from China and innovating in China. So I think that the longer term, we're concerned about sort of an innovation winter. In other words, if the worst case scenarios occur and some of these supply chains are decoupled, then the sort of global innovation ecosystem is going to be affected because, yes, U.S. companies are definitely relying on the China market for both talent and recruiting engineers and also for sales into the China market, and that helps drive their innovation. And so the long-term effect of this is going to damage U.S. companies.
Professor Shen, I want to ask you, because we're spending a lot of time here this morning talking about the remarkable explosion in technology in China in recent years, but there's still a lot of people who feel that China cannot win at the end because it has an education system that promotes conformity, because it has a government that discourages free expression, because it has SOEs that aren't likely to disrupt themselves. What do you think about that? I mean, what are the barriers to technological advancement in China?
This may be a stereotype.
A what? I'm sorry.
A stereotype. The old fashion of thinking. Look at Huawei. It may not be financed by the government, but it is catching up. Look at China's fast train. It may have copied some Western technology. It may have been fined for some of the safety, but over time, it has grown. This is state-owned enterprises. And look at China's fast computing. We used Intel chip to beat the US fast computing. Now US stopped selling such chips, but China could still do. Shenwei Taipei #1 was still #1. Now Summit Dingli has beaten China. That would encourage China to do more on its innovative internal chips. Eventually, China may catch up again. And there's a more US punishment. China may have 2 outcomes. One is China will be defeated. China surrender. The other is that China would rise. China would turn to other countries. EU, not all EU countries would work with US. And China would work with Russia, and China more fundamentally would do self-reliant way. So after 5-10 years, China would make better chips than the US. The US makes the best chips with a Netherlands machine. And the US asked them, don't sell the machine to China, and they may be unwilling. Because after 20 years, China may make a better machine than they would do. Why don't make money before China would replace them?
What do you think?
US would force China to beat America more fairly and more quickly. So why we don't collaborate?
Yep.
China would say, I'm sorry, I should do better. US say, don't do more this way. 2 years you have to finish. And we do joint investigation to punish jointly. So this
Gary,
is the right
go
way.
ahead, and then I'm going to take questions.
So I think Dr. Shen's completely correct on that. I think that in both countries, though, there's one issue that stands out to me as something that's a really significant problem. In the U.S., the strength of the U.S. is the diversity. So now what you have is you have an administration that's very strong anti-immigration. And so we're doing all the things in the United States to keep the smartest people in this room from getting to the United States and staying in the United States. That is an extremely serious problem long-term for the U.S. In China, the government is not taking care of the consumer. So there was a comment by Neil in the first discussion this morning about Chinese consumption. But think about what the Chinese consumer has had to deal with the last few years. Melamine in the milk, so there is very little trust in China in the food supply chain. Number two major vaccine problems. So there's very little trust in the healthcare system. Number three, the stock market's down 50% in the last 2 years after the Chinese government was acting as a cheerleader promoting the stock market. Number four, P2P lending. They've announced $27 billion has been lost. It's probably 4 times that. Now you have the US-China spat. So you're a Chinese consumer and you're sitting there looking at this, and the one thing the Chinese government cannot afford is if the Chinese consumer decides to stop spending, no force on earth is going to get them to spend money. They can tighten up so quickly. And I think that's a major concern with all the surveillance and all the other new systems that they're putting in place. The consumer in China feels a great deal of weight. We just had our annual meeting. Must have talked to several hundred entrepreneurs and all of their cohorts, and they're incredibly concerned that the Chinese consumer is simply going to stop
because
spending.
Because Neil Shen was saying this morning he thinks the move towards a consumer economy is unstoppable.
Well, the trend is that direction, but he also mentioned speed bumps. Yeah. This speed bump could last several years, which would be a serious problem.
What, do we have questions from the audience? Anyone out there? If not, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. I have lights in my face. Oh, right here. Go ahead.
Yeah, just on the Thucydides trap. I don't think the USA
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sorry. George Yip, Imperial College Business School. On the Thucydides trap, I don't think the USA will be like Athens losing a military war to China's Sparta. It will be more like the British Empire gradually losing commercial dominance to the USA. And by the way, the reason it happened to Britain is that not just did it lose its colonies, but its elite lost interest in business and technology. At least I don't think that will happen to the USA.
Interesting. Anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think the reality is that China has developed so fast. So right now China is just serving a humble pie to the U.S. with both hands, and the U.S. refuse to see the reality. I give a very simple number, back to the consumption, in terms of consumption, so that's stoppable. The top 25% richest people, most affluent people, or successful people, best educated people, smartest people in China is the entire US population. So even if you have 3/4 of China stopped, it's still equivalent to the US, right? So that's the sheer size. And in terms of the how the e-commerce, how the online payment has already happened in China. I give you a number. In 2016, the online payment volume in the US was 112 billion, which is not a small number. But China was 8.6 trillion. And then in 2017, Apple Pay really tried very hard to push the online payment. So US grew by threefold to 337 billion. And China, in 2017, the total online transaction volume was 15.7 trillion. How big that is? MasterCard and Visa combined global volume was 12.5 trillion. So that is the sheer size of China's consumption. And even if you stop by 50%, it's still, by the absolute size, it's very,
it can handle some speed bumps.
Yes.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to respond to George? Yes, Professor.
A big feature of China is its sheer size. I would echo you. Whenever US would be innovative to create something new, next day China would have 10 companies to follow. After 1 year, 9 died, but 1 survived.
Yeah.
But because of the size of the country, it has a formidable amount of return and revenue. Look at this Alibaba. Taiwan has similar things, but Taiwan's size is too small. It cannot make a bigger phenomenon. So this is not AI, it is HI, human intelligence, not as intelligent as America. Because your event, we imitate, but we make it applicable in China. Then we make money.
So let me ask you to wrap up here. Let me ask each of you to put on your forecast lenses here. Look 5 years into the future, and say, because you've all been very clear in the last 30 minutes talking about what you think should happen, but now I want you to be predictive. What you think will happen. 5 years in the future, what does the nature of this relationship look like, and where are we in terms of technology competition? Jennifer.
Prediction is always very dangerous, but I have to give a go. I think from China point of view, I think it will be much more predictable and steady. I think China was steadily taking more and more breakthrough in terms of AI, not only just in terms of research, but also implementation. There will be more companies making AI as in ubiquitous technology to support every industry. However, for US now it's a little bit unpredictable. It really depends on who's going to be the next president and what's going to be the narrative.
And you want to make a prediction on that?
I tend to be an optimist, so I think that in 5 years we're going to have some short term. We're going to have a lot of pain and a lot of discussion, and I think the two sides cooler heads will prevail, and we'll get back to a real engagement, but it may take some time. But I think in 5 years we're going to have 5G deployed. We haven't even talked about that, and so we're going to have a new world where the data explosions that we heard about this morning are going to be even more vast, and there's going to be a need for cooperation and collaboration on things like AI, as you mentioned. On
you don't think they can just operate in separate silos?
I think there's a possibility of that, but I tend to think that because of the companies and the innovation and the need to continue that dynamic, I think it's
very quickly, Professor Shen.
More fighting, more threat of fighting, and finally ceasefire agreement, and then more innovation and more U.S. recognizes a need, decent growth. And if we don't catch up, we will be beaten. And 5 years later, China's threat to have trade war with the U.S. Why you steal our stuff?
They've left you time for 2 words.
The environment. In 5 years, we'll be talking about how the two countries are cooperating in an unprecedented way to actually address the environmental issues that we have.
Good. Thank you. Great panel. Thank you very much.